Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's Financial Issues Forum featuring Professor Alan Blinder speaking on his book, A Monetary and Fiscal History of the United States, 1961 to 2021, in conversation with renowned economic historian Professor Richard Silla. My name is Srish Chatterjee, Professor of Finance at the Gabelli School of Business and the Gabelli Chair of Global Security Analysis at Fordham University. On behalf of the Gabelli School, a very warm welcome to all of you who have joined us today. In the last several years, the Gabelli Center and our wonderful co-presenters, the Museum of American Finance and the CFA Society of New York, have sponsored more than 50 events that have drawn about 9,000 attendees. We are tremendously proud of this dynamic collaboration, and a full archive of our video content will be shared in the thank you email that you will receive. In just a moment, David Cowan, President and CEO of the Museum of American Finance, will give a full introduction to Professor Blinder and Professor Silla. Professor Blinder will speak for about 40 minutes, at which point he will address questions submitted through the question field that is located below the video player. Please feel free to submit questions at any point during our event. We will be addressing as many of them as possible during the Q&A session. All attendees of today's event will be receiving digital copies of Professor Blinder's book, with information coming to you following our event. And now I'm delighted to turn it over to my good friend, David Cowan, President of the Museum of American Finance.
Thanks, Harish. Great to see you and all of our friends back again. Professor Blinder is no stranger to most of you, on the faculty of Princeton since 1971, in public service from 1993 to 1996, first on President Clinton's Council of Economic Advisors and then as vice chair of the Federal Reserve. He's an incredibly rich body of work, including scores of scholarly articles and 21 previous books, most recently Advice and Dissent about economics and politics, and before that, After the Music Stopped, about the credit crisis. And of course, his textbook, Economics, Policies and Principles, is powering on, now in its 14th edition. He's a regular columnist for the Wall Street Journal and has appeared frequently on television on Bloomberg, CNBC, CNN, PBS, and others. Dr. Blinder is a distinguished fellow and past vice president of the American Economic Association, a past president of the Eastern Economic Association, a member of the American Philosophical Society, the American Academy of Political and Science, and then the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. And that last distinction he shares with the person he will be in conversation with today, as Professor Silla is also a member of the Academy. Dick is well known to our viewers, Professor Emeritus of Economics and the former Henry Kaufman Professor of the History of Financial Institutions and Markets at NYU's Stern School of Business. He's also the author or co-author of scores of scholarly articles, as well as multiple books, including Alexander Hamilton on Finance, Credit, and Debt, Alexander Hamilton, The Illustrated Biography, and the epic A History of Interest Rates that is now in its 4th edition. He's a current trustee and former chair of the Museum of American Finance from 2010 to 2020. And the quip that I always like to relay about Dick is that Neil Ferguson said that he is the only one he will defer to on American financial history. And with that in mind, I defer to both Alan and Dick as we learn about monetary and fiscal history from 1961 to 2021. Gentlemen.
Thank you, David, for those kind words. Alan, it's great to be with you today.
Nice to be with you.
And I want to congratulate you on doing something that's very hard to do, and that's to write history or economic, any kind of history, right up to the present time. When I was at the start of your book around 1961, I was in college and getting ready to go to grad school, and at that time, I was interested in economic history, which we thought ended with the Great Depression. Now,
Hmm.
nobody at that time would think you could write an economic history of 1939 to 1961 because it was too recent. You have managed, I think, to write a history book that comes right up to the present, and I think you've done it in such a fair way that it will stand the test of time. As the book that you modeled your title on, Friedman Schwartz Monetary History of the United States, 1867 to 1960, that has stood the test of time. People can still read that. I think they'll be able to read your book 50 years from now
Thank
and
you.
say that's a good account of the history. Uh, I'd also say that, you and I are old enough that we sort of lived through most of this history. Probably most of the people who are tuning in today haven't done that. And I would say you and I have been tearing our hair out, you as a macroeconomist and I and policymaker, and I as an economic and financial historian. We've been tearing our hair out about this for the last 60 years, and the viewers can see the results.
Sure.
With that, let me say I'd like to organize a discussion today on the four themes that Alan has in the closing chapter of his book, the four big themes that he learned about. They are in order, but I won't take them in order. Monetary versus fiscal policy. That's number one. Number two is Keynesian economics. Number three is budget deficits. And number four is central bank independence. Let me start with the last two because I think we can probably get through those fairly quickly. Um, Budget deficits, uh, Alan says in the book, in 1961, budget deficits were considered, and I'm quoting him now, dangerous if not immoral. In 2023, Alan says budget deficit 2021 budget deficits were viewed as mother's milk. uh, One of the nice ways that Alan has of putting things in his book. It's entertaining to read as well as informative. Um, so, what changed, Alan, to make budget deficits dangerous and immoral to being sort of something that we just take for granted?
Well, first of all, thank you, and thanks to the museum for hosting this. What changed is several things, of which I would lead with politics. Um, it became clear to many politicians, starting with Ronald Reagan, and that was really the turning point, starting with Reagan, that you could do things if you weren't too constrained by budget worries about budget deficits that you couldn't do elsewise. And in Reagan's case, of course, it was a large so-called supply side uh, tax cut. Um, Republicans, ever since Reagan, have learned that lesson. So the Republicans learned that lesson right away with Reagan. And as you remember, Dick Cheney famously said Reagan proved that deficits don't matter, by which I'm pretty sure he meant don't matter politically. There's no political cost to be paid, even if there is an economic cost. The second development is in economic history and to some extent in economic thinking, especially when the interest rate the government has to pay on its debt is very low, and more specifically than that, lower than the growth rate, that the evils of budget deficits that people worried about, not, and I don't mean the crazy scare tactics that, you know, this is going to bankrupt the nation or bankrupt our grandchildren or anything like that. I mean, the kinds of things economists had worried about for a long time, like higher real interest rates and therefore a lower investment environment, um, didn't really bite that hard, if they bit at all. And therefore, the the major governments of the world, not every government, you know, you wouldn't want to give this advice to Greece or Argentina, but the major governments of the world, including, of course, the United States and Japan and England and so on, Germany, uh, could run easily much larger budget deficits than we used to think. And when I mean easily, I mean without paying a tremendous interest rate premium to do that additional borrowing. You know, back in the Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson days, We didn't imagine that even in the United States, but right now, as you quoted me saying, that's mother's milk.
Right. I have a kind of theory that I thought of while I was reading your book, and that's that back in 1961, there were, very few. I mean, the notion of having a credit card, your own personal credit card, was brand new.
Oh,
And so now today, you get applications for the uh, new credit cards in the mail virtually daily. And uh, as the public has gotten used to running its own personal deficits, I think maybe they find it easier to accept government deficits. I know my father thought government deficits were inflationary,
yep.
and that's, I think he picked that up from Dwight Eisenhower, uh, and we don't really
You're
think
right.
that anymore.
I didn't
Um,
mention that, but you're absolutely right. They were thought very inflationary, and we don't think that anymore. Right.
right. Um, I think, well, let's take central bank independence then. Uh, Few central banks. One of the things I got from your book, and I think I knew it before, but you made it more concrete, is that central bank independence was uh, more questionable at the beginning of this book than in the 1960s than it is today. Um, and furthermore, there were very few independent central
Right.
banks till about halfway through your era. I think you mentioned the U.S. Fed and the German Bundesbank and the Swiss National Bank,
That was
and
almost the whole list.
you're right. And then I think in the late 1980s, I met the fellow once who implemented it, but Don Brash was the head of the central bank in
Hmm.
New Zealand, and they became sort of independent with
Yes.
instructions to have an inflation target at the end of the 1980s, and it worked pretty well. But those were about the only four. So why was central bank independence sort of more questionable in the 1960s than it is today?
Well, I think if you go back to the 1960s, and this includes in the United States, it includes the Federal Reserve, then led by William McChesney Martin, there was this feeling, which some people still have today, that major macroeconomic decisions ought to be made with at least some democratic input, if not completely democratically, which you could characterize fiscal policy as being or doing. Um, in researching the book, I learned I had a vague recollection. You have to go back through the history to make sure your recollection is correct. That there were objections back then in the 60s and into the 70s uh, to central bank independence in the United States, coming from I'll say the far left, Jim Tobin. So this is when the within the economic perspectives. I don't mean wild far left or wild far right, but on the spectrum of economists, Jim Tobin was sort of out on the left, and he questioned the advisability of Federal Reserve independence. And on the far right, again within the economic spectrum, was Milton Friedman, and he questioned the advisability of Federal Reserve independence. Friedman very explicitly on democracy grounds, Tobin more on the grounds that the Fed would be too tight with monetary policy relative to what a more democratic decision making would would give you. As time went by, and we went through the 70s and the 80s, especially the early 80s, government after government around the world saw that experienced more inflation than they thought they would, and certainly than they wanted, and felt that they didn't have sufficient protections against inflation, and got the idea from looking at the Federal Reserve, but especially also at the Bundesbank in Germany, uh, about which the ECB is patterned, as you know, and the Swiss National Bank, and later the New Zealanders, that came later, uh, that making the central bank independent and giving it a legal mandate to keep inflation low. So it didn't have to literally be inflation targeting, which was innovated by the New Zealanders and wasn't really followed by the Germans, but they clearly had a very extremely independent central bank and a very inflation averse central bank, that countries around the world looked at those examples and said, maybe we should do that. And then you came to the run up to the ECB. The Maastricht Treaty was 1992, but the ECB didn't really come into existence for 7 years. But during that run up period, when the Europeans were thinking about what kind of a central bank they would have and what kind of requirements for entry into the monetary union they should post, they decided that an independent central bank was important. People forget this now, but prior to the monetary union, the Germans had an independent central bank, but the French did not, the English did not, the Spaniards did not, the Portuguese did not. Go right down the list. It was based in the ECB area, it was only Germany. And the Europeans decided that was a good model to emulate. So by that time, you had most of the major countries in Europe, excluding the UK, which did not join the monetary union, and the United States and Switzerland, but you still didn't have Japan or the UK. They trundled along a little bit later in the late 90s, again, looking at the example of the others. And maybe it was even peer group pressure. I can't put myself into the heads of members of the Japanese Diet and say to what extent were they jealous of the ECB. I don't know. But by the end of the 90s, you had just about all the major economies in the world with independent central banks. It was a tremendous transformation in roughly a decade.
Mhm. Yeah, I remember the 1960s. Where today we talk a lot about the cancel culture, and I remember that in the 1960s, at the height of the great year 1965, when we had high growth and low unemployment and low inflation, Walter Heller, of course, attributed a lot of that to fine-tuning fiscal policy, in particular the Kennedy-Johnson tax cut.
Yeah.
And but Heller expressed the worry then that he did two things, which I'd like you to comment on. One that Heller, and I didn't see this in your book, but Walter Heller, back in the middle of the 1960s, talked about fiscal dividends. That
Mhm.
they had done such a great job with the Kennedy tax cut, and
Right.
the deficits were going to disappear, and there would be surpluses,
Right.
and those were fiscal dividends. But if the government didn't do something about them, they would
Right.
convert into fiscal drag.
Right.
And so in 1965, Heller started saying, we may have to cut taxes every year to keep the fiscal drag from slowing down our
Right.
economic growth. Of course, Lyndon Johnson changed all that. But so I'd like you to comment on that fiscal dividends versus fiscal drag, but
Yeah.
also, I had a experience in the 1970s when I was in England, and I thought the Federal Reserve was sort of independent then. Um, uh, I asked my friend Charles Goodhart. I visited him. I was on sabbatical in England, and Charles was an advisor to the Bank of England at that time. And but Britain was having double-digit inflation and extremely high interest rates, and I just kind of teasingly asked Charles, how much money are you guys going to print this year? I think that was 1976. And Charles's answer was, we don't know yet because the chancellor hasn't given us the public sector borrowing requirement.
Right.
And what that meant was that the chancellor of the exchequer would say what the British government was going to borrow, and then that would tell the Bank of England how much money to print. That was anything but central bank independence.
Absolutely.
But
Absolutely.
what about the fiscal drag, fiscal dividend idea?
Well, first of all, you're right that I didn't discuss that in the book. In writing a book, I don't have to tell you as an economic historian yourself, you have to pick and choose, otherwise you get a 2,000-page book. So I apologize for not taking that up. But basically, Walter Heller was right economically and as wrong as you can be politically. That's a short answer to your question. So right economically in the sense that We had then an unindexed tax system. Just I'm talking about simple things like bracket rates, which are now indexed, but were not indexed then. So if you had any inflation at all, people got pushed into higher tax brackets, and it was a progressive system, so that meant a higher tax rate, and money flowed in to the U.S. Treasury, um, tending to push the budget in away from deficits and towards surpluses. And just as budget deficits stimulate spending and aggregate demand, budget surpluses constrain, push against the growth of aggregate demand and spending. And so there was this fiscal drag problem, which in Heller's mind was kind of a nice, well, could be cured in a nice way by having periodic tax cuts. And the Congress sort of liked that too. Congressmen like to vote for tax cuts. Again, this is in the pre-indexing days. What Heller was wrong about politically is as you got over the taboo of budget deficits, I don't want to say the last vestige of fiscal discipline, but one of the vestiges of fiscal discipline, and there aren't that many, starts disappearing. And Congress has shown since then a propensity, it had it before, but even more so, a propensity to find ways to spend the money that's coming in. And then finally, in the 1986 tax bill, we indexed the tax brackets. So at least that aspect of the automatic fiscal drag was ended. People don't recognize that as a tax cut. It's just the way the system works. Now, I, for one, was happy with that and a little bit surprised because in 86, I remember thinking, you know, Congress likes to give these tax cuts. They didn't go out in the hustings and say, we cut your taxes again and again. And when you index them, you don't get to do that. But Congress did it anyway. There were a lot of surprising things about the 86 tax reform. That was
Yeah, I actually made a note of that in the I think 14 pages of notes I took when I was reading your book. And the quote you had on the 1986 tax cut was, "It was the finest tax law Congress ever passed,"
I think so.
which ought to make people be interested in going back and studying why it was that. And you just mentioned some of the reasons. Um, uh, Continuing with that theme, though, when by the way, I should have mentioned that you and I know who Walter Heller was, but many of our listeners probably don't. Walter Heller was the economist from the University of Minnesota that was head of Kennedy's and I think a little bit for Johnson's Council of Economic Advisors. And he was the one who sort of pushed through justified the tax cut, and he had a lot of good help from very well-known economists like Jim Tobin and Bob Solow that were on the Council of Economic Advisors then. But then of course William Martin, the head of the Fed, McChesney Martin, decided around 1965 that the economy maybe was overheating a little, so he raised tax rates, and Lyndon Johnson invited him down to the ranch in Texas, and what should we say, scared the bejesus out of him, or tried to. And
I say in the book he barbecued him, but
barbecued him. Yeah.
I don't mean it literally.
Really had a Cadillac convertible, and he drove it 100 miles around his ranch with Martin kind of hanging on to for a dear life. But that's such a difference from the 1990s when you said that in the Clinton administration, and you were part of that, and at the Fed, that the Clinton administration had a standard statement about the Fed, and it was, we don't comment on the Fed. You know, they just didn't get involved. And then we come forward to our own time, and Donald Trump, who castigated Janet Yellen for keeping interest rates too low. Trump was running for office, and immediately on being elected, he said the Fed was keeping interest rates too high, and that carried over to Jerome Powell.
Funny he could change his mind like that, right?
Yeah, so we don't settle central bank independence. It might have been nice if other administrations had emulated the Clinton administration. Like, we don't comment on Federal Reserve. Like, that sort of says they're independent.
You know, the Clinton administration's hands off the Fed policy has set a precedent that since then was really only violated by Donald Trump. Donald Trump violated everything. So, you know, this was the least of it, I guess.
Mhm.
But if you think about a before and after, before Clinton, right up to George Bush the first, who was president before Clinton, almost every president locked horns with the Fed and castigated the Fed and complained about the Fed publicly,
Mhm.
sometimes calling the chairman of the Fed into the Oval Office for discipline. The Fed chairs didn't always take the discipline, especially if they were named Volcker. Uh,
Right.
but there's an episode that I relate in the book that
Mhm.
Volcker had related where he got called in to the office and told him, "You're not going to raise interest rates anymore," and he just walked out without engaging in argument. He was in charge of
Mhm.
interest rates. But just sticking to the verbal, uh, president after president, you mentioned Johnson. It did not stop with Johnson, castigated the Fed. And then Bill Clinton came in and changed all that. I was on Clinton's Council of Economic Advisors, and we were basically all schooled. When the phone rings at 4 in the morning and there's a journalist on the other line, we say, we don't comment on the Fed. The
Mhm.
words were chosen carefully. I think maybe by Bob Rubin, I'm not sure. Uh, we don't comment on the Fed means we also don't comment when we love what the Fed does. Because if we start commenting when we love what the Fed does, when we don't comment, that leaves open the inference we're against what the Fed did and we're
Mhm.
hostile, we, the Clinton government. Then. So, so he did that, and so did George Bush the second after, and Joe Biden is doing it now. I mean, I've pointed out to people, Joe Biden's team of economists and others don't run around like we do saying we don't comment on the Fed, we don't comment on the Fed. But they don't comment on the Fed. Think about it. I mean, you're president of the United States. Your popularity is going down because inflation is going up. I'm just going back a year or so. It must have been very tempting to point your finger and say, we didn't do that, the Fed did that. That, after all, is what most economists think, that you blame the Fed. And the Fed has said, the Fed has accepted the blame. Jerome Powell has said, we goofed and we should have tightened monetary policy sooner than we did. So it wasn't such a big stretch to blame the Fed. But to his everlasting credit, Joe Biden did not do that, and to this day has not done that. So he's back to the post-Clinton norm. Uh, Donald Trump was the aberration. But what people don't know, and hopefully they learn things by reading the history, is that was not at all the norm before Bill Clinton. That was a real break.
Mhm. Paul Volcker was co-teaching a class at NYU with me once, and he said that I think it was 1982 when the economy was in a pretty serious recession, that all of Reagan's political advisors were saying, we got an election coming up, you have to go out and castigate the Fed and say that they're the responsible for all this. And Volcker then said, President Reagan, I think he kind of tongue in cheek, said President Reagan really didn't understand much about monetary policy, but he knew that inflation was a bad thing. And so Reagan told the political people, no, I think Chairman Volcker and I agree that inflation's a bad thing. And so I'm not going to go out and blame everything on him. And Volcker thought that was one of the reasons why Reagan was somewhat admirable. Um, Reagan, a Republican, Volcker, a Democrat.
Yeah, well,
Um,
The Reagan team, including Reagan, though he wasn't very vocal about it, changed later in the 8 year presidency. You're talking about early in
yeah,
the Reagan, and that's exactly right. But later, when the economy needed a little more oomph, they thought they weren't too pleased with Volcker. And as you know, there's this still open question about 1987.
yeah,
87. Did Volcker jump or was he pushed? And I think a fair reading of history is there was a little bit of each.
right,
Uh,
right.
they were not. Volcker himself says that Jim Baker, um, Reagan's right hand man, was pretty pleased to see Volcker walk out the door.
Right. As Volcker walked out on him back in
Correct.
1981 or 2, I guess it was, or
Correct.
what, you're bringing up all we're bringing up all these presidents. I thought shifting now to your second theme, Keynesian economics, which you defined as using fiscal policy to influence aggregate demand. You then classified all the presidents of the period, and I thought it was very interesting. Uh, the ones who were Keynesian in theory and practice included John Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford, Jimmy Carter, Barack Obama, and Joe Biden. These are Keynesians in theory and in practice.
Right.
Then you had Keynesians in practice, but not in theory, and that included Ronald Reagan, George W. Bush, Bush II, and Donald Trump. They are Keynesians in practice, but
Right.
not in theory. And then I thought most interesting of all, you identified two presidents as anti-Keynesian budget cutters. And these were George Herbert Walker Bush, or Bush one, and Bill Clinton.
Right.
And I thought this was really interesting because I believe you would classify yourself as a Keynesian.
I would.
And so you were part of this anti-Keynesian budget cutter administration,
Yep.
and then on to the Fed.
And we were squirming a bit at Bill Clinton's rhetoric. It was not what we teach our students in the classroom. We don't teach them that the way to grow the economy is to raise taxes and cut spending. But that was the Clintons' plan. He used that phrase constantly. We're going to grow the economy by cutting the budget deficit. The theory behind that was never, well, you don't expect the president to elucidate a theory, but really wasn't elucidated very much by the whole Clinton administration, of which I was a part. And, we squirmed a little at the Council of Economic Advisors at the notion that the fiscal multiplier was negative. That is, by doing things that we think of as contractionary policy, you could expand the economy. And what we explained to the president, fortunately, we had a very smart president, is for that to be true, one of two things had to happen, and hopefully both. One was that the Fed would not raise interest rates. You remember, you asked me earlier about the Johnson-Martin clash, that the Fed would be cooperative. And so, not say literally, but figuratively saying, thank you, Mr. President, for cutting the budget deficit. And in return, our favor is not to raise interest rates. That only lasted about a year. And then interest rates started going up. But the other big player in this was the bond market. And Clinton's been famously quoted a number of times by Carville and others. I'm trying to remember. I didn't worry about this too much in the book. About saying, you mean my political fate is now at the mercy of the bleeping bond traders? This is what we, leaving out the bleeping, this is what we explained to him. And he took the gamble. It was a gamble. And the bond market, as you'll remember, did rally very strongly on the credible, and the key word there is credible, Clinton deficit reduction program. And that gave the economy a lot of oomph at a time when it needed it.
Right. And the 1990s turned out to be a pretty good
very good
period.
Janet Yellen and I wrote a little book about that called The Fabulous Decade.
Right. And it seemed to be a decade of, what should we say, tighter fiscal policy and looser monetary policy.
Right.
And I think that's the decade when Alan Greenspan became the maestro.
Absolutely.
And so that was if 1965 was a good year in the United States, when Walter Heller could talk about fiscal dividends, the year 2000 was a really interesting year too, the end of this fabulous decade.
Right.
And it seems like I think you called it, it seems like a joke now, but the people around 1999, 2000 were talking about balanced budgets, and there was going to be surpluses like Walter Heller's fiscal dividends.
As far as the eye could see.
As far as the eye could see, and the national debt would disappear by 2000. I think Al Gore said 2012 or 2018. Other people said.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was really a good year. You must take some responsibility for the 1990s, having been a policymaker then.
I'd like to take as much credit as I can.
Credit, yeah, I should say credit, not responsibility.
Can't really claim too much credit.
But I want to ask you, as a Keynesian, in this anti-Keynesian administration, or what do you call it, anti-Keynesian budget cutters, that really worked out pretty well. Did that register with you and cause you to change any of your own views on things?
A little bit, not too much. because uh, I wrote with Janet Yellen in that little book that I mentioned about the unusual circumstances that helped that policy work. I'll come back to that in a second, meaning that you can't expect it to work over and over and over again. So, what are some of the unusual circumstances? First of all, you have to go into that with interest rates very high, long term interest rates, so they can fall.
Right.
If you go into an episode like that with a 2% 10-year bond rate, you're not going to do it. I mean, it's just impossible. Secondly, you have to have a tremendous amount of credibility. And we, the Clinton team, tried to design the deficit reduction program to maximize credibility, doing some things that the market stood up and looked and said, wow, they did that? I'll give you an example. We people don't even remember this, but I remember it at the time because I made a little side bet with one of my colleagues that Clinton wouldn't go for it, but he did. We actually cut Social Security benefits a little bit, not gigantically, but we did. And the market went, holy mackerel, a Democratic administration is doing that. And we followed, the Clinton team that came in 1993, followed about 10 years or more of blue smoke and mirrors about the budget. I mean, the markets had just seen every trick and were getting sick of it. They didn't believe anything. And we came in without any blue smoke and mirrors. We just came in, this is what we're going to do. Here are the taxes we're going to raise. Here's the spending we're going to cut. And we want to legislate it. And so all of that makes a mix that's very hard to replicate. Maybe not impossible. There'll be other circumstances where something like that, some things like that happen, but it's not the norm. So to your question, it did not make me think that the Keynesian fiscal multiplier is negative.
Right. Well, let's turn to your last theme that I'm picking out, but it was actually the first theme in your book, and that was monetary versus fiscal policy.
Mhm.
And you spent a good bit of time, or I mean, different places in the book you talk about which one is in the front seat and which one is in the back seat. And that seemed to change a lot, vary a lot over the period 1961 to 2021. So what were some of those changes, or was there any sort of major change over the whole period, similar to the notion that budget deficits were terrible in 1961 and their mother's milk now?
In that case, I emphasize the ups and downs more than the long-term secular change. But to answer that last part of your question first, it was pretty clear by the 2010s and 2020s that policymakers look much more toward monetary policy than towards fiscal policy for stabilizing the economy. And the opposite was true in the 1960s. Let me just take those two ends. But I want to emphasize, without going through the detail, look, that's why this is a 400-page book, that there were a lot of ups and downs in between. But back in the 1960s, when Kennedy proposed and then Johnson managed to get through Congress the Kennedy-Johnson tax cuts, monetary policy was firmly planted in the back seat. And William McChesney Martin, who believed in the independence of the Fed, was nonetheless happy to think of the Fed as part of the economic team and that their job was to accommodate. That's where that word comes from. Accommodate the tax cuts, meaning not let interest rates soar because of the deficit implications of the tax cuts. And I have a quote in the book that I didn't memorize, but I was stunned when I found it in researching this book. In the 1968 economic report of the president, so Johnson is president, then and trying to get a tax cut through Congress, there's a statement of the belief of both the White House and the Federal Reserve. Just imagine that. The Federal Reserve is right in there in the economic report of the president endorsing the White House position. And that position was that the fight against inflation, which is the problem of the day, was mostly the responsibility of fiscal policy, not monetary policy. I mean, you just can't imagine anybody saying that. Left, right, middle. I mean, nobody would say that today. So that's illustrative of how firmly monetary policy back then was planted in the back seat rather than the front seat. By the time we got into the 2000s and 2010, most economists barely thought about fiscal policy when they thought about stabilization. That the whole job was monetary policy. That's who steered the economy, trying to strike a balance between high employment and low inflation. Then came two gargantuan events, which said, to continue my maybe clumsy by now analogy, everybody should jump into the front seat. And that was the financial crisis of 2007, 8, 9, where with Ben Bernanke taking the lead to fight this, and then quickly realizing that once the interest rate got down to almost zero, and he was doing QE like mad, quantitative easing like mad, it wasn't enough, and the Fed needed help from fiscal policy. So he was practically begging for more help from fiscal policy, which arrived when Barack Obama became president, and in 2009, by the skin of his teeth on a completely partisan vote, got the Recovery Act passed. So that was both, both hands on the wheel. And then, of course, the pandemic, when again, well, I was about to say again, monetary policy moved first. They both moved at lightning speed. The Federal Reserve just dropped interest rates like a stone in March of 2020. And in that very same month, the CARES Act passed Congress, the largest fiscal stimulus in U.S. Well, if you don't count World War II, the largest fiscal stimulus in U.S. history, and it passed the Congress in, like no time flat. So it didn't take a lot of convincing at that time for the policymakers, both on the fiscal and the monetary side, to realize that they both had to put the pedal to the metal. Otherwise, we were in a very, very dire shape.
Right. Well, I think one of the arguments against using fiscal policy, it would take too long a time for Congress to act, and maybe the circumstances would have changed by the time they did. You point out in the book that they were capable, and you just pointed out here that they were perfectly capable of changing fiscal policy on short notice.
Yep.
But that seemed to be what you call these gargantuan events, the global financial crisis and pandemic.
In that interim period between the Johnson era, let's say, and the Bernanke-Obama era, the view that you just stated was the dominant view, that fiscal policy was too slow and clunky to actually do any good in the relevant time horizon, and Congress then proved that wrong.
Right. Well, we could go on talking to each other for hours, I think, but it's probably time to turn it over to some of the questions from outsiders. I think there should be a good list in this kind of stimulating, for me anyway, very stimulating discussion with you. David, do you have some questions?
Cerise is going to go first.
Okay, Cerise.
Thank you, Professor Blinder. Thank you, Professor Siva. That was just an extraordinary discussion on a variety of very interesting and important topics. We do have a number of questions, so some of them may have some overlap, but let me start with the very first one from Jesse Garcia. The question is, considering that the stagflation of the 1970s coincided with the first global wave of debt accumulation in the past half century, how did US debt relate to the staggering inflation rates
Sorry, I lost the last few words, but I think I can interpolate them from the previous words. I think in that period of time, this is my opinion, the deficits were more symptoms than causes. That is to say, when the economy sags as happened several times in the 70s and 80s. Tax receipts fall, expenditures on unemployment and a variety of other things rise, and the economy moves in the direction of deficits. I don't believe on the other. So the other way to tell the story was there were huge deficits and that led to inflation. I don't think that was, there might have been a little bit of that, but I don't think that was the main story of the 70s and early 80s. The main story of the 70s and the early 80s was supply shocks. That, well, first, I guess I should go back. There was this legacy of higher than we wanted inflation that came out of the 70s and early 80s. So, if policymakers could have waved the magic wand in 1973, 4, 5, and Nixon tried with price controls, by the way, they would have wanted a lower inflation rate. But we had what we had. And then that was exacerbated by tremendous supply shocks, food and energy in the 70s and early 80s. And it was left to Paul Volcker to try to stamp the legacy of inflation out. You want to think of inflation as very inertial. So it jumps or it jumps down, and then it tends to stay there. This is like Einsteinian, Newtonian physics, unless acted upon by an outside force. And so Paul Volcker was that outside force at the end. But at the beginning, the outside force was mostly the supply shocks that I just mentioned, not budget deficits.
Thomas Cowell asks, how can the Fed and other policymakers help increase the labor force participation rate among various demographics, whether it be parents, rural men, others, and might this help decrease wage inflation and increase capacity?
Well, I'm going to give a paradoxical answer to that question. The Fed has very little that it can do on labor force participation, with one big exception. And that's the paradox of the end of the question. The one big exception is to run the economy hot. And the labor market has been now for years, since we came out of the pandemic catastrophe, quite hot. And when the labor market runs hot, wages go up, real wages go up. That's why it's paradoxical for the end of the question. When real wages go up, people get drawn into the labor market more than otherwise. It's not revolutionary, it's more evolutionary. It's around the edges. There are always some people that are deciding, should I be working? Should I not be working? They may be very young people. They may be old people. They may be women or men, for that matter, who have just experienced a new baby and they're wondering whether to go back in the labor force, or they just graduated from high school or college. There are a whole lot of reasons why at least a sliver, and not a trivial sliver, of the labor market may be close to the margin. Whereas if they see they can earn a bit more, they'll go in. And if they don't see they can earn a bit more, if wages look bad and employment prospects look bad, they don't go in. So that's the way the Fed can exert at least some influence over labor force participation. And if you think of it that way, they've been going whole hog on that. I mean, we have an unemployment rate now, the last measure, 3.4%, the lowest since 1969. If Jay Powell asked me, should we do more on that, I would say, no, I don't think so. I think you've done enough on that.
You left out, Alan, that the Fed could increase labor force participation by hiring more unemployed economists.
There aren't too many unemployed economists, but yeah. Fortunately, we don't have a lot of unemployment in our profession.
There we go. Connor Murphy asks, what would be the advantages and disadvantages of an independent fiscal authority that could set the total amount of money that could be spent, leaving the allocation to elected officials with perhaps exceptions for wartime or other exceptions? It seems to me that elected officials do not typically, with notable exceptions, have a strong understanding of finance or economics. Well, what's your experience, Alan?
Well, my experience on that last thing is absolutely yes. They don't. It's very different at the Federal Reserve, where sort of everybody has very good understanding of that. But the question was about the fiscal side of the House. I have to admit that I'm somewhat attracted to that idea intellectually. In fact, I once upon a time wrote a paper called "Is Government Too Political?" That was meant to be a paradoxical sounding title, and I finished the paper with an example not of spending, which is your questioner asked about, but about the tax code, and sort of imagine that Congress would set broad parameters. Do we want an income tax or a consumption tax? Do we want it to be progressive or regressive, and a few other things like that, and then leave it to a panel of experts like the Federal Open Market Committee to design the tax code. And the rhetorical question is, don't you think we'd have a better tax code if we did that? And I do. Uh, so you could make the argument for the spending side. The problem with both is that it's quite hard to square those things with democracy, that you're giving over to a bunch of unelected technocrats a lot of the authority that properly resides with the elected representatives of the people. And in fact, of course, the Constitution puts it there. Now, someone could say, well, the Constitution also gives Congress the power to, the phrase in Article 1, Section 8 is coin money and regulate the value thereof, which is what the Federal Reserve does. So the Congress would have to delegate that authority to a bunch of technocrats, which they have with monetary policy. I have a very hard time imagining Congress doing that with fiscal policy, with spending and taxes.
Sarah Hakem says, thank you, of course, for the discussion. We want your views on the future of finance. This always comes up. Blockchain, technology, central bank, digital currencies. Where do you stand on all this?
Everything. First of all, I think Sarah came the question.
Yeah.
You want to take my answer with the appropriate grain of thought. I'm 77 years old. All right. If I was 27 years old, I'd probably have a very different answer for you. But that said, there is a school of thought, and I'm very sympathetic to this school of thought, that says that cryptocurrency is an invention looking for a purpose other than hiding out from the law and from the tax collector. That's an obvious purpose, which up to now has been served mostly by cash, $100 bills. When's the last time you saw a $100 bill? If you were a crook, you'd see them all the time. But crypto can deal with a lot bigger amounts than that, and is not that bulky when you want to start dealing with millions or even billions of dollars. So there's a niche for crypto. I've put the worst gloss on it, saying it's crooks and tax evaders. There's also a school of thought, as we all know, that just doesn't trust government. These are the people that buy gold and bury it in the backyard and probably have a bomb shelter in the basement to protect them from black helicopters and so on. And if they want to do that, that's fine. So crypto certainly has a somewhat of a future for hobbyists, let's call them, collectors, hobbyists, whatever you want to call them. The last thing I'll say is, if you think of crypto, which its advocates often do, as a more efficient form of currency, first of all, I don't believe that. I don't think it's very efficient. But anyway, if you do, I think the issuance of central bank cryptocurrency, which the Chinese have done and many other central banks, including the Fed, are thinking about whether they should do it, with high likelihood will drive the legitimate users out of the private sector and into the central banking sector. I mean, why would you hold Microsoft, never mind Microsoft, I'll make up a name, Bugaboo money, when you could hold Federal Reserve money equally and have it in an electronic wallet and things like that? So I think the Federal Reserve could, if it wants to, I don't see that it wants to, drive the private issuers largely out of the legitimate uses of cryptocurrency if it wanted to by issuing its own uh, cryptocurrency. I don't know if the Fed is going to do that. I think my guess is not, at least not for a while. That's why I started my answer by saying I'm 77. Uh, if I was 27, I would probably say, probably in my lifetime, it's going to do that. Uh, but I'm not so convinced it's going to do that in my lifetime.
A number of years ago, when you spoke to us about your book after the music stopped, you relayed that when you were at the Fed, you felt you were one step behind Wall Street, but by 2008, they were 10 steps behind, but reacted terrifically and gave them very high marks after.
Yeah.
Where's the Fed now? Are they a couple steps behind Wall Street? Are they close? Are they in tune?
I don't know the answer. It's a very good question. I don't know the answer. It's clear, as I said then, and I've always believed, that the Federal Reserve cannot ever keep pace with the financial innovation that comes out of the innovators. That's what they do. The people at the Federal Reserve are not sitting every day thinking about how can I make innovations in the financial system to make money. But a lot of people are doing that. They're always going to be one or two steps ahead. What I used to say then is when we get 3, 4, 5 steps behind, that's when I worry. And I don't have a good sense of where the Fed thinks it is now or where I think the Fed is now. The one thing that's getting a lot of play in financial innovation is not so these days, right now, is not so much new financial instruments, but crypto. That was asked about in the last, and I already gave you my old man's opinion on cryptocurrency. I may just not be aware of it, and if you had a young Wall Street bond trader here, he or she would be more aware of it. I'm not aware of a plethora of new financial instruments, new exciting financial instruments that are grabbing people's attention. Those are the kinds of things I worry about when on this general subject. And it, I may be missing something. I'm not sitting on the Federal Reserve Board, but I don't see a lot of it happening right now.
Alexander Dell asks, with debt at record levels, interest rates where they are, the U.S. interest rate payments alone are going to skyrocket. We're bound to have more and more QE or printing. Are we in a debt death spiral? Where do you see this going?
Was part one of those death spiral? Debt spiral?
DEBT, death spiral.
That makes the question easy. No. If you left out the death, are we in a debt spiral? I think we're sort of right on the margin, and we may be. The interest burden of the federal debt in recent years has been very, very low. It's gotten higher very recently by a lot. And nobody knows at this point how long what we now call, quote, high interest rates. I'm laughing having done this book about 60 years. A 4% Treasury bond rate is not historically a high rate. But if you got used to 1%, paying 4% is quite a lot. So the interest burden in the federal budget is now much higher than it has been for the last couple of years. A sidelight point to that, which I thought the question was going to be about, maybe it was, but I didn't hear that, is the Federal Reserve has in recent years been turning over its profits, seigniorage, to the Treasury of around $100 billion a year. That has now turned negative. People don't realize this. The Fed is running at a loss because seigniorage is going negative. It is paying more on bank reserves than it is collecting on its bond portfolio. That's something very, very new. To my knowledge, in the history of the Federal Reserve, that has never happened before. At some point, some congresspersons are going to catch on and say, wait a second, in the context of the budget, you guys used to send us $100 billion a year. Now you're sending us a bill. And that's not going to be a happy day for the Federal Reserve. And I'm not sure how it will get resolved.
For our final question, I'm going to combine a couple on the same theme from Vladimir and Barbara. What effect, if any, will the graying of the U.S. and other developed countries have on Fed policies? Are Do we need to see a cut in Social Security? What are you thinking about this?
The graying of the U.S. population, as with others, is already and will continue to put a strain on the budget. The arithmetic is pretty simple, right? The baby boomers were born from 1946 on, and a lot of them are on Social Security and Medicare already, and more will be coming. Pretty soon, the whole generation will be on that. And that requires, by law, Rick Scott notwithstanding, requires by law more government spending. And the Social Security system and the Medicare system are not in actuarial balance. Something has to give. A little bit of it may be cutbacks in benefits for Social Security and Medicare, but my guess is most of it is going to be higher taxes of some kind. Rather than ring a gigantic fire alarm, these don't have to be gigantically higher taxes. You were talking probably about 1% or 2% of GDP. By personal analogy, think if your home state raised the sales tax by 1 percentage point, you'd grumble about it a little. You didn't like it, but it's not going to change your life. So it's tax increases like that at some point. Now, the key phrase there is at some point. Congress doesn't like to do that. Their constituents are not happy if they raise the payroll tax or cut back on Social Security benefits or anything like that. And as we now know, I'm pretty sure we know, this is going to be a big election in the 2024 presidential race. Joe Biden has made that clear and believes it's a winning issue for the Democrats. I think he's probably right about that. But regardless of whether he's right about that, it's going to be a big issue, and that's going to push this back. Nobody between now and the next presidency is going to think seriously about that. So the actuarial deficit will just grow a little bigger than it is now. And it is true, as many of the critics have said, that the longer you let this problem fester, the bigger it is. So it would have been nice if we did something about it years ago. We didn't. Well, we have on an occasion, but we didn't do enough. It's going to, at some point, it's going to get so close as it did in 1983 with the Greenspan Commission. This is not about monetary policy. It was about Social Security. It was getting really close. The Social Security was going to have to start cutting back its checks. And that spurred the Congress to action. My hunch is that it's going to take that again. That it won't do to say in the year 2031, we're going to have a gigantic problem. And until you get to the year 2029. And then that gigantic problem is staring you right in the face. That will spur Congress to action. But I want to just finish that thought. It's not like you need titanically sized cutbacks in either spending or increases in taxes. Modest ones will be enough.
Well, we're staring at the end of a phenomenal hour. I want to thank you, Alan and Dick. It was tremendous.
Thank you.
Sorry for all, yeah, you're welcome. Sorry for all the questions we didn't get to. They were flooding in. On behalf of Fordham and the CFA Society and the Museum of American Finance, we hope to see you all again. Brad DeLong, February 23rd, Slouching Toward Utopia. It's a 5 p.m. It's not a noon. Please tune back in. Thanks again, Alan and Dick.
Well, thank you. Bye
Thanks.
now.